The Minority Whip.
Mr. President, this December marks the 7th anniversary of the passage of the First Step Act, the most significant reform to our criminal justice system in a generation. That victory was born out of years of bipartisan negotiation, led by myself and my colleagues, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, and Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Democrats and Republicans working together. The end result was and continues to be life-changing for the people who were impacted. The First Step Act delivered needed reforms to our outdated sentencing laws and provided real opportunities for incarcerated Americans to safely re-enter their communities. Those reforms have reduced populations in overcrowded prisons, reunited families, and revitalized communities these men and women re-enter as productive neighbors. And the evidence backs it up. Just look at the numbers. Of the more than 40,000 people released under the law through January 2024, just under 10% have been rearrested. 40,000, under 10%. Compare that to the Bureau of Prisons' overall recidivism rate, which is 45%. The difference between 10% and 45% is striking, and it shows what we can achieve when we're smart on crime and follow the data. I want to take a moment to highlight the story of one woman from Alton, Illinois. So often in my congressional career, things that have inspired me come from stories of people and real lives. This is one of them. Her name was Eugenia Jennings. As a teenager, she sadly experienced the injustice of our antiquated sentencing laws firsthand. She was terribly abused as a child, and by age 15, Eugenia Jennings was addicted to crack cocaine. At age 23, as a mother of 3, Eugenia was sentenced to over 20 years in federal prison for selling less than 14 grams of a drug. In prison, she turned out to be a model for others. She took all the courses available to her, overcame her addiction, and talked to students about the dangers of drug addiction. Sadly, while she was incarcerated, she developed leukemia. I asked President Barack Obama, my former colleague in the Senate, to commute Eugenia's sentence, and he did just that. It was the first commutation he issued. Eugenia was released just in time to see her oldest daughter graduate from high school. I cannot tell you the joy in her voice when she told me that. She passed away 2 years later, but her story has lived on and served as a driving force behind my efforts to reform our federal drug sentencing law. Eugenia's story led me to meet more individuals whose lives were forever altered by unfair sentencing laws, including Matthew Charles. Matthew also had a difficult childhood, enduring both physical and verbal abuse. He joined the Army at age 18, but found himself still filled with anger and hurt, eventually turning to what he called wayward living and selling drugs. He received a state conviction and then a federal conviction. And because he had a prior conviction when he ended up in federal court, and because he had been selling crack rather than powdered cocaine, Matthew received a sentence of 35 years. 35 years. While in prison, he worked as a GED tutor and law library clerk, in addition to mentoring young people. He helped other incarcerated individuals who could not read to understand their letters and court documents, and he drafted filings for them. In 21 years in prison, Matthew did not receive a single disciplinary infraction. After Matthew's conviction and sentence, Congress passed a law I wrote called the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine offenses. But the law was not retroactive. When Eugenia and Matthew were sentenced, the hands of the sentencing judges were tied because Congress severely limited a judge's discretion to impose an individualized sentence and instead mandated overly harsh one-size-fits-all penalties. The First Step Act took one giant step toward correcting that unfair system. Among other reforms, it made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. Matthew Charles was one of the first people released from prison after the First Step Act became law. But as the name of the First Step Act suggests, it's just that one first step. There's more to be done. To make our system fairer and our communities safer, we need to continue to reform our sentencing laws in a smart way. That's why Senator Grassley and I reintroduced a package of bipartisan bills to expand on the progress of the First Step Act. One of those bills, the First Step Implementation Act, legislates, among other things, that retroactively apply the First Step Act sentencing reforms to sentence imposed before the law's passage. This would impact people like Matthew Charles, who were sentenced before Congress reformed. People like Eugenia and Matthew deserve a second chance. The First Step Implementation Act would make redemption for more individuals like them possible. The First Step Act's passage was a glimmer of bipartisanship in a political arena. It was signed into law by President Trump in his first term. Its success shows what we can accomplish on behalf of the American people when we put aside our political differences and come to the table with reasonable approaches. We need evidence-based solutions to reduce crime and make our communities safer. So as we celebrate this 7th anniversary, I'll continue to work with my colleagues to reform outdated sentencing laws. Let's rekindle the spirit of bipartisanship and get something done in the Senate. I call on my colleagues to support the Grassley-Durbin legislation, First Step Implementation Act. Together we can reduce crime, improve our justice system, and make America's communities safer. I yield the floor.